Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this discussion of a critical article review. And so in this video, what I'd like to do is talk about a couple of different things. First of all, an overview of what is a critical article review and what we're looking for when we're looking at a peer-reviewed article. And then also kind of talking about where we will find specific things in this article. So to begin, I like to first define this whole notion of critical. And by critical, I don't mean that I'm criticizing the article. I don't mean that I think that they've done a bad job. I'm not kind of wagging my finger at them saying, you should have done something different. Rather, it's a thoughtful or a systematic review of that particular article. Now, one thing that you'll find as soon as you get into actually doing research on your own is that you'll find that there are a lot of limitations that you cannot skirt around. And so if I say, well, one of the limitations of their study is this, it's not that I'm criticizing them or saying that they should have done something differently. Maybe that was the only way to study that particular relationship. What I'm doing is I am saying in my own mind, this is something that I need to be aware of so that when I am interpreting their results, that I'm giving careful weight, careful thoughtfulness to how I utilize the results that they have been able to show. So I'm being careful, I'm being thoughtful, I'm being systematic about how they did their study so that I can be aware of the limitations and the usefulness of what they've been able to show. So that's my spiel on critical, not critical as in criticizing. So an article generally has 4 main parts. I've included 5 because the first is the abstract. And the abstract has all the other 4 parts in it, and it's a summary. And so it tries to take all of what the article has found and put it in a very short, if you had just a couple minutes to explain to somebody what this article was about, the general gist of it, that's what you'll find in the abstract. And the abstract has these next sections: the introduction, which is kind of the background, setting the stage, the methods. How did we do the study if somebody was trying to understand how did we get our group, how did we collect the data, all those kinds of things. The results, and this is often where you'll see the tables and graphs and figures. And then the 4th part of the body of it is the conclusions or the discussion. And that might include a discussion about the limitations and that sort of thing. So the abstract has all of those parts in it, and then the main body has an introduction, a methods, a result, and a conclusion or discussion. So we have an article. It's laid out in a similar way so that people know where to find things. And the main things that people are often looking for are, in addition to what did the study show, we're also looking for the purpose, and that can be found here in the introduction. And specifically, it is almost always in the very end of the introduction. It might be the last paragraph or the last sentence where the authors will say, the purpose of this study is to blah, 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 blah. So if you're looking at what the purpose of the study is, look at the end of the introduction. The methods section is where you're going to find a couple of things. Who is the population that I'm studying? In other words, who can I generalize this to? That's where I'll find my population, and I'll also find information about the design of the study. Was it a case control? Was it experimental cohort? All of those kinds of things are often either described or explicitly stated. Every once in a while you'll get the design of the study right in the title. So it'll say blah, 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 a clinical trial, or blah, 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 a prospective cohort. And so sometimes you get more information from the title and the abstract, but within the paper, this is where you would find information about the design. Who were the people that were included? How were they recruited? And also how did we measure the different variables that we were interested in studying? And then one of the other things that you need to have a close eye out is for specifically biases. And these can actually be anywhere. What were some things about the way the study was conducted that might be systematically pushing your results in one direction or another? Remember, random error can be any direction. It's kind of, it's not differentiating. But differential error or bias can be discussed anywhere. And so as you're reading through the paper, keep a close eye out for biases. A lot of times I'll put a star in the margin every time I come to something that might be alluding to that we think this is a particular bias. The researchers are identifying a limitation of the study. Specifically in the discussion or the conclusion, there might be a section labeled limitations. And a lot of those limitations are related to this notion of kind of biases. But they may be other limitations of the study, just the way the study was conducted. So those are some places to find those particular items. And specifically when we're thinking about the analysis. So we've done an analysis and we want to show our results. The analysis often includes 3 different parts. We have just describing or descriptive statistics. Then we want to look at 2 variables related to each other. We call that bivariate. And then once we've looked at the bivariate, comes answering the actual question that we were often trying to answer, and that's accomplished often through multivariable analysis. And within this results section, usually those are presented in that order. And so we describe the group, some of the demographics about the group. Specifically, we need to know about the variables of interest, for sure, how they're distributed within maybe our exposed versus unexposed, or with our cases or controls, that kind of thing. So we're describing all of the variables that we're studying, and then we look at them together in pairs, bivariate, and then we put them all together in a bigger model. And so many standard peer-reviewed research topics follow that format in terms of the analysis. Now, of course, if you have something like a meta-analysis where you're looking at multiple papers, it may not follow that same flow in terms of descriptive, then bivariate, then multivariable statistics. But the typical studies often will follow that process. And so what I'd like to do next is I'm going to take an actual paper. If you're in the class, then you have a PDF copy of this. The name of the paper is A Primary Care Intervention to Prevent Repeat Pregnancy Among Teen Mothers. The primary author is Amy Lewin. There are others. And so if you have a copy of this, then follow along and I'll point out where certain things are important within this paper. And so let's start off with the introduction. And the introduction usually starts broad and goes narrower and narrower and narrower until we get to the purpose of this particular study. So within the introduction, it often starts off with setting the stage. What is the problem? What are the main ideas? And so in this particular paper, here we see that we're looking at adverse outcomes related to a couple of different groups. So we have adverse outcomes among teens, adverse outcomes among African Americans. We know both of those groups have worse outcomes, both for the mother and for the baby. And so this paper is setting the stage to say, we really want to take a look at this particular issue. The next part of the introduction kind of follows the format, what is known and then what is not known. So you might have a paragraph or 2 that talk about each of those different things. and it might even introduce the notion of what our intervention is. Maybe we want to describe a little bit about the intervention so that we can say, well, we don't know if this is helpful to that particular problem, the teen pregnancy, African American pregnancy issue. And then at the very end of the introduction, that's where we get our purpose. And as soon as you see this study does blah, 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 or the purpose of this study is to evaluate something. Sometimes we have more than one, and in this particular paper they're enumerated, number 1, number 2, that we're trying to evaluate these particular outcomes. Then we get to the methods section, and there's some variability, but often we start out by saying this is how we're going to do the study overall. And one of the things that often will be specified is that we're trying to make the two groups be comparable. And so they'll talk about the ways that they tried to do that. And so that can be kind of a clue about some of the biases that might be popping up as the study goes through, whether they were able to achieve that or not. We want the two groups to be the same on everything except for that one thing that we're studying. And so sometimes they'll try to talk about that. The next section often talks about the study design, specifically who the participants were, how they were recruited, who was eligible to be in the study, how many of them stayed in the study, if there were certain restrictions that we didn't allow certain people to be in the study or didn't qualify to be in the analysis. In this particular study, I think we ended up with, we started out with 150 who we could have studied, and then we ended up with 98. And so that gives you an idea about how selective it was when we went through the study. Does this actually represent even the group that we're trying to represent? Much less can we generalize it out to a larger group of people who are trying to be the population of interest. Next, often we'll talk about data collection. What methods did we use to collect the data? What variables were collected? How are they classified? All kinds of things about measuring. In the study design, we talk about who the people are that we included, and then in the data collection section, we talk about the variables that we collected from each of those people. And so specifically, we want to know how did they collect information about the different predictors. Could be the intervention itself or other demographic type predictors. Also, we want to specifically know about the outcome. So often that outcome will be described in detail and how they collected it. So both the intervention and the outcome. In this particular case, they talk a lot about the intervention being part of that particular group. The outcome in this paper is repeat pregnancy. How did they measure it? How did they determine if somebody had a repeat pregnancy? Some of the important predictors were contraceptive use, romantic involvement with father of the baby, the depression scale. They talk about how they measured each one of those, at what time frames, how they were administered, and that sort of thing. So that gives us enough of a picture that if somebody wanted to try to replicate this, which is encouraged, then we would be able to see, well, maybe this one was done in a particular location in the United States, and then we need to know if those same results can be found in a different population, maybe a different part of the United States or a different area, that kind of thing. And then finally, within the method section, often there is a discussion about the statistical analysis. And so we want to see what statistical tests were used at those three different levels, the describing, the bivariate, the multivariable. And so they tell us what software even was used. In this particular paper, they talk about intent to treat, which means that once a person was assigned to that group, whether or not they participated in that program, or whether they were didn't participate, they were still included for the purpose of analysis. So that's actually methods. They tell us about what they're going to do. And then in the results section, we actually see this. Usually the first paragraphs have to do with the descriptive statistics. Then they move on to talk about the bivariate. And then we end up seeing what the multivariable. And in this particular case, we have a table for each one of those. If you turn to, I think it ends up being like the third or fourth page of the article, you'll see table 1 and table 2 on that page. Table 1 is a pretty typical table where they give overall what are some of the characteristics. You'll see for some variables we have a mean and a standard deviation, so those were continuous or scale variables. And for others, they have put the percentage outside of parentheses and then the n inside of parentheses. I don't see that as often, but you just have to be aware of that as you're going through the table. If you're looking very closely at this table, on the second line where it says age at 24-month follow-up, this is of the child. And so I think they intended not years, but months. They intended for that to be age in months because it says 27. The child wouldn't be 27 years old at 24-month follow-up. So that was one error that I picked up that might confuse you if you weren't aware of that. The other thing that they've included that is kind of controversial or somewhat controversial among statisticians is that they have included either chi-square or F values to compare the generations versus the intervention group versus the non-intervention group, the comparison group. And there are many who would say that doesn't belong in a table 1, that people should just look at the raw percentages and see if those groups look like they're similar. And the reason is that this study was not powered to be able to pick up on those specific differences. It can't be powered to test that many relationships correctly. And so, but then others say, well, just eyeballing it, that doesn't give me enough information. There are certain journals who will not publish p-values in a table 1 that's supposed to be descriptive statistics, and others that almost require it. And so you can see that this is not necessarily, there's not a standard way of doing it. If you see them there, then just be really careful about the way you interpret them. So just be aware that those p-values, the chi-square and F in this case, and the p-value, it's not agreed upon whether that's a good idea to include in a table 1. But we do see that this romantically involved with the father of the baby at 12-month follow-up, it looks like it is quite a bit different between those two, the intervention group, the generations, and the comparison group. So that's one thing that's quite a bit different between those two groups, and we could hypothesize about what it is about the generations program that might prompt that. Table 2 then looks at bivariate associations between those variables that we said we were interested in knowing about: contraception, romantic relationship with the father of the baby, and depression, and are those related to the outcome that we're interested in. Not only is being in the intervention related to the outcome repeat pregnancy, but are these other things associated with repeat pregnancy? And we see specifically that contraception use at 12 months is a good predictor of repeat pregnancy at 24 months, which is kind of something that we would expect. So you can look at the direction and the types of the groups within contraception that tend to have a higher pregnancy versus a lower pregnancy. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that for 2 of these variables, we have all 98 answered that question. So contraceptive use, if you add those numbers up, 16, 15, 15, 43, 9, we get to 98. And that's the total number that we found in table 1. This is our total final group. 58 in generations and 40 in comparisons. So that adds up to 98. Also, depression at 12 months, the CESD score, was it above or below the cutoff? We add those 2 together and we get 98. However, the romantic relation status with father of the baby, only 96 people answered that particular question. So maybe it was a more sensitive question. And so what that does is when we get to table 3 on the following page, our N is only 96. And so that's going to impact our analysis when we get to this multivariate question. So when we're looking at those 3 levels of results, then we need to be aware of what happens to the sample size. If the sample size in table 3 was half of what we had seen in tables 1 and 2, then that would tell us something important about the sensitivity of some of those questions and whether people were willing to answer them. There are a couple things that I'd like to point out in table 3. Remember early on we said this was an experimental study, specifically quasi-experimental, so this is a cohort. And so some people ask, why would we use an odds ratio in a cohort study? And the reason is, the title gives you a little hint, what we're ending up doing is we're using logistic regression because our outcome is dichotomous. Pregnancy at 24-month follow-up is a yes/no question. And so logistic regression is specifically very good at looking at that. And logistic regression ends up giving us an odds. And so you can use what you know about odds ratios. Specifically, this needs to be kind of like a rare occurrence in order for odds ratio to approximate relative risk. And so we might get numbers if this is not rare, if pregnancy at 24 months is not less than 5%, then our odds ratio may not estimate a risk ratio very closely. And you could even do the math yourself and see if it does. So you can see that all of those are odds ratios and 95% confidence intervals. You can also see what's called a pseudo R-squared. It's not technically an R-squared because this is logistic regression, but their attempt is at the same thing. What proportion of the variability in pregnancy at 24 months is predicted by whether they were in the generations program or not, whether they were using contraceptives at 12 months or not, whether they were romantically involved or depressed or not. Those kinds of things. You'll notice for step 1 where we only have the intervention program in the model, our pseudo R-squared is only 2%. So 2% of repeat pregnancy at 24 months is predicted by whether you're in generations or the control group. That doesn't seem like a very big number. But then when we get to step 2 and we have not only the generations but also contraceptives in the model, that jumps up to 23% of repeat pregnancy as predicted by our model. So you can kind of follow that. Basically what we're looking at when we're looking at these odds ratios and we're looking at these percentages is we're looking at signal to noise. That critical ratio is really telling us how much of this is just kind of random error, it's bouncing around, versus how much is actually being caused by these predictors that we have in the model. So you can look at that and see. I would say that from step 2 to step 3, where the generations program goes from 1.02 to 1.17, that's just, we have a kind of a small sample size, less than 100. It's going to bounce around a little bit. I would say that's noise. But going from 0.55 up to 1.02, and the article talks about how this the generations program is mediated through the use of contraception. In other words, that's the way that they're being effective. That probably is a significant change, going from half to 1. So that's kind of like a run through of the different tables. Within the discussion part or the conclusion, sometimes it's called different things, and this one is actually broken in 2. We see kind of like a discussion of what does that mean? How do we apply that, like in our practice or in our experience out in the world. Also, an important piece of that conclusion part of the paper is a discussion about the limitations. Basically, this whole thing is just trying to answer the question, what do our results actually mean clinically when we are thinking about applying these to either our practice or our work at a public health department? How would these be meaningful? So that is an overview of kind of me talking through an article and the different sections where you'll find things. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing your assignments.